Hello, I'm Lori Bazaler of the Edward Hazen Foundation. Thank you for joining us for this session today, where we want to focus on justice-focused practices in philanthropy to support community-driven work. We'll be using our experience at the Hazen Foundation as a case study, and I hope that there are ideas that will help you to think a little differently about your own practices in your own foundations. They certainly apply to social justice funders, but I think that there are things about the way that we've come to do our work that can apply to any foundation. Really, the central message of this is that we should all take the time to consider not just what we fund, but how we fund. And for Hazen, that was catalyzed by the 2016 presidential elections, where we saw an uprise in organizing and activism in the face of some real threats to the basic rights of so many people in our country. Our funding focuses on two areas, which one is community-driven education justice work, and the other is youth organizing on racial justice issues. And at that time, those two issues really increased in their activity and also the threats against them. We saw that our grantees were stepping up in times when their own safety was often threatened and really being so courageous in their response. And it pushed us to think about whether we were doing what we could to step into that moment with the kind of innovation, courage, and vision that they were. We'd like to start with a short video to give you an idea of the kind of work that Hazen funds. This is Communities United in Chicago.
Students at North Lawndale College Prep marched in silence, carrying crosses with pictures of victims of gun violence, the tape across their mouths symbolizing both the silenced voices of those killed and the voices of those crying out for help from lawmakers but feeling ignored.
It's a battle that people in their community have been fighting for decades.
Communities United.
Communities United.
Communities United is a grassroots organization that goes directly to the community to address these issues that are affecting marginalized people.
We work along the lines of public safety, mental health, affordable housing, immigration reform, and education. Youth have a powerful voice and that they can use it to change things themselves.
If pain is in our community now, pain will forever be in our community in the future if we don't make a change. We are here joined together in unity, fighting for the same goals.
Young folks may not use the same words like school to prison pipeline, but they know because they've watched their friends be slammed onto tables, handcuffed, and got to put in jail. And they might not use things like the word trauma, but they know what it's like to watch someone die.
Youth is important for social change because we're the future. That's why I just really love doing this work, because it just helps to have people that actually care about you, and they push you and you push them to keep becoming a better you.
If you move as one, you're bigger than that one person that told you no.
We are survivors of a cruel and silent nation.
We participated in March for Our Lives.
I gave a testimony about my brother. He passed away in February of this year.
It was sad what happened in Parkland, and we didn't want that to happen, to anybody in these schools. Nobody should have to go through that. But we also wanted to show that, in Chicago, we go through that on a daily basis.
We are here to fight for life in peace.
I've lost plenty of people that I've known throughout my whole life. In fact, I probably lost at least one person every year.
Yeah, we need stricter gun laws, but it's more to that. Gun laws is only a first step. We need more mental health inside of our schools. We need more jobs for youth. We need better education for students.
Youth activism helps you get woke by educating you and involving you within the community that you already live in.
We are survivors of lack of resources within our schools. We are survivors of social, emotional, and physical harm. Then we will not stop until we are properly resourced in our communities. Today we say no more. As youth must now be the change that we see. Shut down!
It's a collaborative of all young people, like we're at the face of it.
I'm going to start with Christina as a board member of the Hazen Foundation, who was with us when we made some really dramatic changes in how we consider our work and do our work. Can you share a little bit about the process, what it was like, what were the factors that led to the decision, and that experience from a board member's point of view?
You know, I'll just start from a point in our recent history that Lori mentioned, which is the 2016 election, and the truth that the outcome of the election forced the country to face, about just how not only deeply divided the country was, but how at the root of the support for racist policies and racial hatred was our country's long history of white supremacy and systematic racism. And I think that for Indigenous communities, for Black communities, for immigrant communities, Brown communities, we've known this because we live this every day. And in the work that grantees of Hazen and groups like United We Dream are doing, we leave these injustices and inequities every day. But the 2016 election really brought awareness and an awakening to the country that we hadn't had in recent history. So as many of you may remember, the country was having a vibrant conversation about how did this happen? Is this who we are? How do we move from here? And what can we do to create change? And that kind of conversation also was brought into conversations that philanthropic leaders and institutions were having, whether that was among staff or boards of different foundations. I was recruited around that same time to be a board member of Hazen, and it was a true honor to be asked to serve as a board member of a philanthropic institution that really spoke to and put in practice values of equity, values of racial justice, of education justice, and that I spoke to a vision of the country that was inclusive, multiracial, justice, and democratic. So of course I had to say, yes, I was very honored and excited to serve in this role and to bring into practice not only my lived experience as an undocumented person and an undocumented immigrant, but also as a youth organizer that has been part of building a historic movement of young people that has changed our history, our conversation around immigration, and that will continue to bring tremendous amount of change to the country. And it was the conversations that, like many other foundations, we were having about what do we make of this moment, and what do communities in the front lines at the center of the attacks that we experienced, not only during the election cycle of 2016, but also when the new administration took over, the attacks on Muslims, the attacks on Black people, the attacks on immigrants and refugees, the attacks on our environment, and many of the issues and policies and campaigns that many of the grantees at Hazen have been working on. These communities were truly at the center of that impact and of the suffering of changes of policy at the federal level and the ongoing targeting and racial profiling of young people, particularly young people of color. So when we saw our grantees at Hazen really facing the moment, not only in a fierce way, but with a determination to fight back, to inspire people to get involved, to defend communities and protect communities, whether that was from police violence to deportation or family separation, we asked ourselves the question, Can philanthropy meet the courage and the fierceness of the communities that are in the front lines in this moment? Can we step up to be as courageous and as fierce as this moment really required? And that's really what shaped a lot of the essence and the foundation of the conversations that we had around whether to make a choice on to continue in perpetuity or to make a decision to spend down and to step up and to support communities in the front lines who were impacted by injustice and by the attacks of the new administration in ways that were truly life or death moments and life or death situations. And I was proud that I was part of the decision to spend out and to give all of our resources in this particular moment, not only for our grantees to be able to face the moment and fight back, but to also together work to build a new America that we need, a country that is truly inclusive, multiracial, and where all of us, regardless of the color of our skin or where we come from, can live freely. And to support youth movements who have been at the center throughout history and in our ongoing moments of politic conversation and campaigning. It is young people, whether it is on the climate justice or racial justice or immigrant justice, that have been leading the change with a lot of courage. So we decided to spend out and support grantees in the moment to be able to defend communities and to bring change to the country for the longer term. But I will say that the thing that I will close with to Lori's question is that in thinking about the conversations that we had in those conference rooms and calls when we were deliberating on this question, I think the people that were in the room making those decisions, having the conversations, and ultimately making the decision for the foundation really matters. And the fact that the foundation's leadership at the board level and with Lori as executive director was intentional to disrupt dynamics of inequity, dynamics of injustice, and dynamics of power that perpetuate oppression in communities of color, and intentionally sought out to recruit board members that not only had the lived experience from communities that have faced injustice and live and experience injustice every day, but also community organizers, youth organizers, and leaders from the movement, whether that is in the racial justice space or the youth space or the education space, that have been creating change. And the combination of people who have the practical experience and also the lived experience of doing youth organizing and supporting movements to grow made a big difference in terms of the substance of the conversations that we were having, the questions that we were having, and ultimately the decision that we made. So I will say, what are some of the things to take away from this? Who's in your board really matters. The decisions that you make about the board members that you recruit, the staff members that you recruit. Again, like at Hazen, Lori has a tremendous amount of years of experience on supporting movements and youth organizing and knows the field deeply. Our program officer, Isabel, comes from the youth movement as well. And Isabel is part of implementing the grant making strategy at Hazen. So at all levels of the foundation, I think has been so critical to bring people both with the lived experience and with experience in the field to make these decisions. And by doing so, not only are we making better decisions, but we're also transforming philanthropy and using money and resources that have been the source of so much pain and injustice, but we're also using it for good and to bring justice and to reflect in our practices and our decision-making the values and the vision of the kind of country that we want to see.
I think one of the things also is we also were concentrating and very aware of the opportunities in that moment, that there were really so many people who were stepping up into activism who hadn't before, and that it would take resources to make that really powerful. And the other thing I think, just to really note, I do think that the substance of the conversation was dramatically different because of the people having it. I also think that there was a real concern that the field not suffer, right? Whether it was because we weren't putting as much resources out now, or what would happen when the foundation closed its doors. And I really appreciated that, because I think that was a part of who was in the room, people actually running organizations that we fund and so forth. Let me ask you, Maria, as a longtime Hazen grantee, what was this experience like for Communities United? I mean, interestingly, the director of Communities United was on the board at the time. So your organization was deeply involved in many ways. And then you've had the experience of going through that and now working with us since, before and since. So what was that like for you?
Thank you, Lori and Christina. Your remarks just hit home. And I think, like, one of the things that working with Hazen Foundation is really reflective of our model. Like, so, we started, so Communities United is a survivor-led organization, in which basically means that people who are survivors of the issues that we work on, like, housing, education, youth rights, right, are at the forefront and leading the conversations and implementing the solutions that they develop. And so, as a survivor-led organization, our approach to the work has been, since we started, but has fully developed maybe like around 6 years ago, that we refer to as healing through justice. And healing through justice is basically this idea that being given a purpose is actually very healing for people, right? And the approach is really built on relationships of people and them identifying themselves as survivors and knowing that there's wisdom and power within that room. And so when you talk about, Isabel, like being part of the board and you coming from the youth movement yourself, like that's exactly where we come from, right? Like I'm the youth director at Communities United now, but I started when I was 16. So this is technically my 17th year in organizing. Really for us, this work is really about the building the relationships. And, when Hazen made the shift, one example that really comes to mind is last year, when we had started engaging with Isabel from Hazen and kind of talking a little bit about the work that we do. And then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic was really, really heavy for a lot of our people. Being survivor-led means that our people, that our leaders are the ones that are really the most impacted when COVID hit. There was already a lot of issues in Black and Brown communities, right? Or the lack of investment, the lack of support, the lack of everything. And then when the pandemic hit, it was like little to zero support. And people were panicking, people were hurt, our parents were losing their jobs. For some homes, our young people were the main breadwinners of the family. And then if they weren't and they had to go to school virtually, they had to take extra responsibilities, like taking care of their siblings, right? They became the moms and the dads of their family so that their parents could go out there and find work and make sure that there's still money coming in the home. It was a really heavy time. And, when you talk about the process that Hazen went through, one of the things that really would always stay with me was that instead of having, we were due for a check-in, right? And instead of having to write a grant, like a proposal or a report, instead of doing a site visit, which let's be honest, site visits are they're a little nerve-wracking, okay? So they're fun, but they're very nerve-wracking too, because you're trying to express, if it was for me and I was a site visit, I'm trying to tell you what I've been doing for the past 16 years and that it's worth your investment. And I'm trying to do that in an hour, right? And it's hard. And, with the backdrop of the pandemic, Hazen actually said hey, you don't have to do the report. We're not gonna do a site visit. Rather,
what is it that you have on your calendar already that you're already working on so we could be a part of it? And that was just like, that was so good, because it was like, yeah, we can show you what we do, right? We can show you the beauty and I can show you why I wake up every day and why I feel good. Let me show you that. And so Hazen attended one of our town halls, and the town hall at the time was a youth-led town hall with our leaders, and they were talking about the effects of the pandemic and what are they experiencing, what solutions are they thinking of. And it was just so much better to be able to show the work, and for Hazen to understand, like, this is why, despite how hard things have been, we continue to move, because our young people that led this town hall, they talked about, even in this time context, why safety matters for Black and Brown young folks, especially in schools. Our young people were able to have all that. And I think the other piece of that was our young people were able to build relationship with the folks that from Hazen that came to the town hall, because they were able to interact, right? And interacting and building relationship with your partner, because that's really what funders are. They are your partner in this fight, in this journey. They were able to have that relationship that you couldn't get in a written report, right? A much deeper, less like, hey, this is who we are, this is our environment, we feel safe here, I hope you do too. And that was just that was one of the things that really stood out, because can you imagine just going home and facing all this pressure? And it was just so beautiful to be able to share that experience with one of your funders and your partners, and to show them why you wake up in the morning, and not have to try to explain it, but you get to be a part of the experience. So that's what I would say, that how it affected us at a very small micro level, but that was wonderful.
That's great, Maria. Thanks so much for that. And I think you really hit on why we made those kinds of changes, right? So having made the decision to spend out, the foundation did a whole listening process with the field, where we had focus groups and surveys and just a lot of one-on-ones talking to people. And what we were really looking for were ideas about how our position as a foundation could be more in support rather than in this sort of oversight, command and control kind of way. We were really looking for ways that foundations use our resources and our position to maintain power over organizations. And that is a part of the whole design of philanthropy. We have money, we control who gets it. And trying to, ramp down that power dynamic, and to think about where really the roots of that are in ideas about white supremacy, about who can handle money, about who deserves it. Also, with the written proposal about how information is conveyed, and is, the written academic proposal the best way to understand the kind of community-driven work that we do. Maria is a great organizer. She may be a great writer, but she doesn't have to be a great writer to do her job. So why would we want her to spend a lot of time doing that for us when she should be doing her work as an organizer? So for us, it was really about thinking about how are we just reifying white supremacy through the decisions we make and how we do our work. And so that was one of the big changes we made. The foundation does its work differently. And I've had people, when we talk about this, ask, so what has changed for the staff? We do a lot more upfront work. We spend a lot of time online. We're looking at websites and following social media and interacting online with people in, especially during the pandemic, but even so, just to get background information. And then we contact a prospective applicant. We don't actually go into a conversation until we have some idea that there's a possibility that they might get funding, because we don't really want to be the people who are wasting their time. We want to honor their time. And so we do that work. And then we have a very specific interview protocol for a first conversation, for a conversation with community members. And we send all of those questions ahead of time. And we send the criteria that we'll be using to assess it. Because this is about trust, about them being able to show their best selves through that process. It's not about trying to catch them up. And we think that that also helps to build this kind of authentic relationship that we're hoping for. I'm wondering, Maria, we didn't talk about this so much, but I was wondering if you might speak a little bit more about the relationship building and how that has worked for you and your members of Community United.
So that is a great question. I think when people think about relationship building, I think some folks would be like, oh, so we meet them once and maybe we'll follow up a couple of times. But really, so I'll give an example. Like when we talk about multi-year general operating grants, right? Which is like the gold mine of all the gold mines, right? Because it's like, that's exactly, when you do like multi-year operating general operating grants, it's really like an a funder basically telling you like, I know you, I trust you with your work. I have faith in the way that you spend your money and where you invest. Here is a general operating grant, and we will be in that journey with you because we believe in you. And that is like, that says a lot about the relationship between the organization and the funder, right? So with Hazen, for example, we don't just hit up Hazen when we need money, right? Like that's not how it works. That's very transactional. It's and life isn't transactional. When we engage with Hazen, it's really more about like, it's also about strategy, right? It's about like, hey, can we pick each other's brains on how we move things forward? Like, this is our vision. What are your thoughts on it? And it's about, it's not just this traditional way that we see funder and organization relationship, but rather it's a true partnership that really talks about, hey, as an organization, what is your vision and how do you see that moving forward? Which is why multi-year is really important too, because like, organizations, like we're in the business of dismantling oppressive systems. And dismantling oppressive systems, like the criminal justice system, like even the health system, the education system, like that stuff takes time. So there's stuff that we can do like, short term, but ultimately we have to have a vision of what's going to happen years down the road. And when you have this relationship with a funder where you can actually strategize together and think about like, what are the possible challenges? What are the possible solutions that we could come forth and really act as a partner? That's really what you need, right? Because if I was going to meet with Lori, right, and I'm like, Lori, I want to do this thing with whole school safety, right? Because this is one of the campaigns we have touched in my mind right now around like, basically like dismantling the education system that's over-reliant or just reliant on police. Lori can come in with a perspective as a funder and think about like, well, I know some funders that might be interested in that, how can we strategize in bringing forth that together so that we could actually address the gap of, funding when it comes to like the education work that's centered around youth organizing. And I think that like, being able to have those kind of relationships where you're not just like hitting each other up about money, but you're really hitting each other up because in this fight of dismantling oppressive systems, it's not just on community-based organizations, it's also on funders and it's also on your partners. So how do we like crush that? Like, that way that we used to think about it. And in terms of like how we build relationships, it's really about that constant like, ownership of the work, and you build ownership by strategizing, thinking things together. I want Lori and Christina to know the young people I work with, because I can't just tell you how amazing they are. You guys have to actually see them. That's how it works. And I think that the new process that Hazen went through allows for that, right? It allows for that flexibility and to be responsive on what's happening on the ground.
Yes, and one of the things I would also say is that we've been able to connect grantees with grantees or other kinds of organizations, because of the kind of way that we get to know what they're working on and how they're working on it. So they may be in different places, but working on a similar issue and helping them to learn from each other has been really, really rewarding for us, and I think helpful for the organizations. But you touched on one piece, which Hazen has done multi-year general operating support for a long time now. But what we did do with the spend out was make those grants significant to the size of the organization. And trying very hard to give them enough space to really, really think and experiment. And in this case, with the pandemic coming right at the beginning of our funding, it meant that they had the ability to respond. And that was one of the things that we also did at the very beginning of the pandemic, is we reached out to all of our grantees. We reminded them it was general operating support. It could be used for whatever they needed. And some of them were remarkably creative in terms of giving mutual aid and using that as a community building and community organizing process, so that, you know, helping to prevent people's evictions, getting people food, really basic, critical needs that they had, also helped them build those trusting relationships. We saw that really beautifully in many ways across the country in community organizations. And of course, the pandemic is the biggest example I can think of, you know, the need for changing plans and being flexible. Without general operating support, that would not have been possible. Now I want to transition over to Christina and ask you what these changes have meant from your perspective as a board member. Has it had an impact on how you do your work, or how you understand your role, or the information we give you?
Yeah, it was so wonderful to hear the lived experience on your end, Maria. And I have been on those shoes as well, as when I was executive director of United We Dream, in terms of different foundations, different requirements, and some of them are just quite overwhelming. And so, I think that to some of these practices and changes that we've made, I think what has been useful in reflection is to have board members that also have the experience of being in grantee organizations of other foundations and having to do the work of fundraising. And in many conversations, I feel like we got the space to share both our lived experience, but also suggestions and ideas about what is required in a report. What are we asking? I mean, we still have philanthropic organizations that are aiming to define what success is for a community or for movements, or aim to measure via arbitrary numerical metrics what success is like, and what change and how change is measured, without acknowledging that actually comes from the communities impacted, that the knowledge about how to do this work, what strategies work, and how to measure or think about transformation and change and success, those are the questions and the information that actually come from community. People closest to the pain and closest to the injustice are the ones that are best positioned to not only develop the strategies to bring change to communities and to transform systems, but also to inform, especially those of us sitting in philanthropic roles, to inform how we think about supporting and how we think about success, so that our views of success and measuring are not narrowed to policy change, because quite frankly, yes, many of us are seeking policy change in our work, but that can take 20 years. I started organizing around the DREAM Act back in 2004. The DREAM Act has not passed yet in Congress. So it's more than a decade of work, of organizing, of building support, and though we have seen change. We've won things like DACA, for example. We've been able to change the hearts and minds of people. We've been able to defend people from deportation. If philanthropic institutions are only thinking about measuring success via policy change, then according to many foundations, our movement wouldn't be successful. And so that's the kind of conversation that I think is different when you have, again, the people in the room with lived experience and that also have the field experience to be able to shape not only the options or the practices that we can try differently, but also to know that even when we come from the field or have lived experience, to know when we say, we need to ask the grantees. This is a moment where we want to hear and we need to hear from the grantees. And throughout the process, we created many entry points of information where we survey grantees. When Lori spoke to grantees one-on-one and directly to, when the COVID-19 hit in March of 2020, it wasn't like us trying to think about what is going to be good for the grantees. But it was about, we need to find out what they need and how they need support from their partner foundations to be able to address any needs at the moment. And through those one-on-one conversations, through the relationships that Maria was talking about, I think able to hear from the grantees and to inform the way that we were thinking about not only just like our rapid response orientation, let's say, to COVID-19, but to think about our general practices of background making. That has been, I think, very important. And then the last thing is that it is also about what we're not asking about, right? Like what are the things as board members that we, I think at Hazen, because of the composition of our board and the expertise and the lived experience of our staff, we are not asking questions that are in a way hyper scientific or that will create, additional burdens to the organizers who are dealing with usually life or death situations, or frontline organizations that are having to respond to people losing their jobs and also being struggling with the virus, as Maria was describing this moment that many communities of color went through. So in moments like that, I think it was less about, let's do a research project about understanding the scientific impact of this pandemic or the impact long term of some of the systematic oppression that these systems inflict of communities of color. But it was really about knowing that we needed to hear from the grantees and that was a source from where we started and the foundation from where we developed changes to our practices of grant making, but also how we oriented around moments of urgency and crisis.
That's really helpful, Christina. I do think that that having you and others on our board who are doing the work has been tremendous for me as the leader, the staff leader of the organization, because we only know what each of us know about the work, and we really have just riches on our board of information and knowledge, and I think also respect for the organizations we're supporting. I think we just have a few minutes left. I'd like to ask you each, this is your opportunity to give a few words of advice to foundations. And what would you say? Maria, do you want to go first?
An advice I would give to funders, I think, is it kind of reminds me. So I'm an organizer, so obviously I'm a storyteller, so you guys can just edit here. But it reminds me of the one experience I had back when I was still a teenager and I was still a youth volunteer in my organization. And this one funder asked a question that I was like, whoa, that's a good question for funders to ask themselves, which was, this funder said, what can I do to make sure that wherever my money goes, it doesn't cause any harm? right? And I thought that that was such a good reflective question, as somebody who has power, right? Like you said, Lori, like being funders, and I think Christina, you mentioned it too. Like you have a lot of power in where you want to spend your money on, and where you want to invest, and who you want to support. And I think it's really important to ask those reflective questions. But I think Christina said it best, which is like, if you have a question that you're reflecting on, you should also ask your grantees, right? Because they're the ones on the ground. Like if I'm an organizer and I want to do an event or something's happening, my first reaction is, how do I deliver this information to my young people, and how do I get their reactions? Because it's them on the ground that whatever policy is made, that's tied to their lives, right? So I want to know what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And I think as funders, take advantage of the fact that you could also do that. You can reach out to your grantees and ask them like, hey, we know this is happening. What are you all, what are your challenges? What are you struggling to? What is the best way to support you? And I think that if you allow for that space to be created, the relationship will build. And I think it'll be a lot easier, because when working with young people, man, they push the envelope so much. They're so innovative and they're so wonderful. We always let them take the lead. And I think like with funders, you have the opportunity to create such a beautiful partnership with your grantees, engage in strategy, talk about what's going on, and really take ownership of the vision where you put your money in. And I think that that's the best way to say it.
Thank you. And Christina, do you have any thoughts?
Thank you, Maria. And I agree with what Maria had just shared with us and invited us to think about. I will say two pieces of advice for those of you who are part of these workshop. One is that people closest to the pain are closest to the solutions. If your foundation is working to end a problem and poverty and educational injustice, to transform the conversations that we're having about racial justice or poverty, of gender justice, you name it, right? Doing the work of making this country better, then the people closest to that pain and closest to that injustice are the ones to be supported, because they are the best situated to come up with the solutions that we need to see the change that we want to see. So when you think about your grant making strategies, to who is making the decisions, who is part of the implementation of the work, from whether it is foundation staff or foundation board members, all of those things matter related to this value of those closest to the pain are closest to the solutions. The second thing I will say is that, one of the things that I think only was possible because of the last election in 2016, it's that we're having a different conversation about forces of white supremacy and injustice, and because of movements, particularly thinking about the movement for Black Lives, the climate justice movement, the Me Too movement, the immigrant justice movement, we're having a different conversation about the country that we need to build. And so unless we confront the truth of these powerful forces that have shaped institutions, including philanthropy, and we make a commitment to transform those and to change them, we're just not going to be able to achieve the missions that many of the foundations hold central to their work. So it's a choice, and it's a moment of choice, and it's a moment of opportunity right now to make decisions about who is part of your decision-making, who is leading your organizations, and what are the practices in our ground making that can bring the kind of transformation and change that we want to see, and the values that many of our foundations hold.
That's great. Thank you, Christina. I think the only thing that I would add from the point of view of a staff person is that nothing is set in stone. We make so many assumptions in philanthropy about perpetuity, for example, being a very, very big one, that is the default position. And I'm not saying that it's right or wrong for any foundation, but what I do think is right is to always check back on those kinds of assumptions in light of your mission and the current moment. And that means that you will always be putting your mission first rather than your own survival as an organization. We have a lot of power in these organizations because in our society, resources bring power. And we can use that much more creatively, I think, than we give ourselves the opportunity and the permission to do so. So I guess in some ways, I would just advise everyone to dream a little and to question a little. So thank you. We put up our Twitter handles on the card for you to see. And if anybody has any questions or follow-up, I'm going to be present for the live airing, I guess, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But we also would welcome follow-up through our contact information. Thank you very much. And thank you, Christina and Maria.